You don't belong here, man. The words hit just as hard as the soda, splashing against Jaden's hoodie, dripping down his sleeve. The laughter that followed was cruel, echoing in the near-empty parking lot. Connor stepped forward, his smirk widening. Say something. Or are you just going to stand there? Jaden inhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to clench, but he forced them to remain loose. The chill from the soda seeped into his skin, but the burn in his chest overpowered it. His uncle's voice echoed in his mind, "Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want." He exhaled. Then he walked away. But the moment would linger. The bus ride to Richwood Heights had been long, the kind that lulled people into sleep with its rhythmic rocking. Jaden, however, had stayed awake, his head resting against the cool window as the city skyline gave way to endless rows of identical suburban houses. Moving wasn't new to him, but this one felt different. His mother had taken a better job, hoping for a fresh start. His uncle had scoffed at the idea. Fresh starts don't exist for people like us in places like that, he had said. Jaden knew better than to argue. Stepping onto the campus of Richwood High, he had felt it immediately, the shift in energy, the unspoken tension in the air, the way conversations paused as he passed, the way some students looked at him, then quickly looked away. Teachers greeted him with strained politeness, their smiles just a little too tight. It was nothing new. The first few periods passed without much trouble. He kept his head down, answered when called on, and focused on the work. But by lunchtime, the weight of the stairs had settled onto his shoulders like a second skin. Holding his tray, he scanned the cafeteria for a place to sit. Most tables were already full, conversations flowing freely between people who had known each other for years. A few students exchanged glances, whispered something. He caught bits and pieces, new kid, wonder how long he'll last. Jaden ignored it. He always ignored it. Then he spotted an empty seat near a guy who was too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than standing there like an idiot. He had barely set his tray down when a voice cut through the noise. "You lost." Jaden turned. A blond guy with an easy smirk leaned back in his chair, arms draped over the backrest like a king surveying his court. A few others at his table watched with amusement, waiting. Jaden exhaled slowly. "Didn't know I needed a map." The guy chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure. Not a lot of new faces around here." There was something in his voice, hesitation. The unspoken part of that sentence hovered between them. Jaden met his gaze, expression unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but behind it, something else flickered, amusement, maybe curiosity. "Welcome to Richwood, man." Jaden didn't respond. He just sat down, picked up his fork, and started eating. The message was clear. This wasn't over. And it wasn't. At first, it was little things. Side comments in the hallways, whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Didn't know they let guys like him in here. Wonder how long he'll last." Nothing he hadn't heard before. Jaden ignored it. He wasn't here to entertain their ignorance. But Connor Tanner wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. Son of one of the most influential men in town, Connor carried himself with a kind of confidence that came from knowing the rules didn't apply to him. Quarterback, student body president, golden boy, he had the entire school wrapped around his finger. And for whatever reason, Jaden's presence at Richwood was a problem for him. The first real test came in his locker. Jaden was swapping out his books when a sharp bump knocked him forward, his shoulder hitting the metal with a dull clang. "Oops," a familiar voice drawled. "Didn't see you there." Jaden didn't react. He finished grabbing his notebook, shut his locker, and turned. His movements were slow, controlled. If he gave them nothing, they'd get bored. Connor grinned, leaning casually against the neighboring locker. "You're quiet, huh? That's cool. Real cool." Jaden held his gaze, not angry, not scared, just looking. For a second, Connor's smirk faltered. Then one of his friends, Nick or Kevin, they all blended together, muttered something under his breath. Connor chuckled, regaining his confidence. "Catch you later, new guy." Jaden watched them walk away. The hallway noise returned. That was the first time. The second time was in the cafeteria. Jaden was heading toward the trash cans when a foot shot out. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. His body jolted forward, but he caught himself before he could fall. Laughter. Connor held up his hands, mock innocence dripping from his voice. Relax, man. It was a joke. Jaden didn't say anything. He didn't look at him. He just stepped over Connor's foot and kept walking. More laughter. Someone muttered, "Too easy." Jaden clenched his jaw. His uncle's words echoed in his head. A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark. He exhaled. Let it go. But that wasn't enough for them. Because the third time, Connor made sure it wasn't just a joke. And that was when things changed. The air outside was crisp, the sky painted with the soft hues of early evening. Most students had already gone home, leaving the parking lot nearly empty except for a few lingering cars and scattered groups of friends wrapping up their conversations. Jaden wasn't in a rush. His mother wouldn't be home from work for a few more hours, and he had nowhere else to be. He had just stepped out of the library, his backpack slung over one shoulder, when he heard them. Hey, new guy. The voice was familiar. Jaden barely had time to register the sound before something smacked against his back part. The force of it sent him stumbling forward, his foot scraping against the pavement as he caught himself just before hitting the ground. Cold liquid seeped through his hoodie, ice cubes scattering around his feet. The parking lot went silent. He turned slowly. Connor stood at the center of the group, still holding the empty cup, the last few drops of soda dripping from his fingers. Nick and Kevin flanked him, their expressions a mix of amusement and expectation. There were a couple of others too, guys Jaden had seen hanging around but never cared to remember. And just beyond them, a few students who had been getting into their cars stopped what they were doing, drawn by the tension in the air. Damn, my bad, Connor said, not even attempting to sound sorry. Didn't see you there. Jaden glanced down at his hoodie, the dark stains spreading across the fabric, sticky against his skin. He inhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay steady. Silence stretched between them. Connor smirked, taking a step closer. Come on, man. Say something. Jaden didn't. He had seen this before, lived it too many times. There's no winning here. No clever comeback that would change anything. He had two options, walk away or give them what they wanted. He chose the first. Shifting his backpack higher on his shoulder, he stepped past Connor, his expression unreadable. That was when Connor shoved him. It wasn't playful. It wasn't just a joke. It was forceful, meant to provoke. Jaden staggered back a step. His breath remained even, but he felt his fingers twitch at his sides, the tension coiling in his muscles. Laughter again. What, you scared? Nick stepped forward, grinning. No, man. He's just soft. Jaden's hands curled into fists at his sides, his nails pressing into his palms. He forced himself to unclench them. His uncle's voice echoed in his head again. Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want. Connor was watching him closely now, eyes gleaming with anticipation. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove something. Jaden exhaled slowly. Then he set his backpack down. For a brief second, Connor's smirk flickered. Oh, you got something to say now. Jaden didn't answer. He just rolled his shoulders back, his movement slow, measured. Connor chuckled. Man, you. That was as far as he got. Jaden moved, quick, clean, precise. A step in, just enough to make Connor react, then a sharp right hook to the ribs. The sound was sickening. Connor's breath shot out in a choked gasp, his body folding in on itself. He staggered, but Jaden wasn't done. A pivot, an uppercut, perfect form. Connor's head snapped back, his balance crumbling beneath him. His legs gave out, and he hit the pavement hard. Silence. Nick and Kevin stood frozen, mouth slightly open, processing what had just happened. Jaden took a step back, adjusting his hoodie. His breath was steady, controlled. Connor groaned, rolling onto his side. Jaden finally spoke. You done? Connor didn't answer. He just coughed. Jaden's gaze flickered to the others. Anyone else? No one moved. He grabbed his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder, and walked away without another word. But he knew what happened in that parking lot wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the next morning, the entire school knew. Jaden didn't have to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said everything. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore. Some were impressed. Some were nervous. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time. Connor wasn't in school. That part didn't surprise him. Taking a hit like that in front of half the parking lot wasn't something you bounce back from overnight. Nick and Kevin, they kept their distance. Jaden walked into class like nothing had happened. Sat down, pulled out his notebook. Business as usual. But that didn't mean people were done talking. At lunch, as he moved through the cafeteria, conversations quieted when he passed. People whispered. A few nodded at him like they suddenly respected him. Some freshmen, who hadn't even spoken to him before, acted like he was some kind of legend. And then there were the others. Damn. Didn't know new guy had hands, someone muttered as he walked by. Bryce had it coming, another voice added. Heard he's not coming back for a week. Jaden ignored it. He wasn't here to be a hero. He wasn't looking for validation. Then he heard something else. He's just another violent thug. The words were soft but not soft enough. Jaden turned his head slightly. A couple of girls at a nearby table. One of them, a brunette with expensive-looking jewelry and an expression like she smelled something bad, looked away when she realized he had heard her. His stomach clenched. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right the situation felt, someone always found a way to twist it. But he didn't regret it. Connor had gone looking for a fight. Jaden just made sure he got one. Still, the weight of it all sat on him. He had spent years training, years controlling himself, years walking away. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. So why did it feel like no matter what choice he made, people had already decided who he was? But Jaden was about to learn that real strength wasn't just about throwing a punch. It was about what came next. The tension in the air hadn't faded. If anything, it had only thickened, spreading through the school like wildfire. Jaden could feel it with every step he took. The stares had changed. Some held quiet admiration, others uncertainty, and few concealed something uglier. It didn't matter how much he tried to keep his head down. The fight had marked him in a way that was impossible to ignore. By midday, it became clear that the parking lot incident wasn't just a rumor. It was a story. Everyone had their own version. Some claimed he knocked Connor out cold with a single punch. Others said Connor cried when he hit the ground. A few even swore Jaden had been waiting for an excuse to fight, that he had set Connor up from the start. He ignored it all. But it didn't mean it didn't get to him. Jaden had spent years training, controlling his temper, keeping his movements measured. Every instinct, every lesson drilled into him told him that walking away had always been the better choice. Fighting was never about proving something. It was about discipline, about knowing when and when not to strike. And yet, here he was. No one cared about the times he had walked away. No one cared about the times he let the comments slide, about the way he had ignored the shoves, the taunts, the attempts to get under his skin. None of that mattered now. Because one fight was all it took for people to decide who he was. He could see it in their eyes. The admiration, the hesitation, the fear. Connor's absence only made it worse. If he had come back the next day, bruised but still standing, maybe the energy around Jaden would have faded sooner. Maybe the school would have moved on. But Connor was gone, and his silence only fueled the rumors. Some said he was suspended. Others said he was too embarrassed to show his face. Jaden wasn't sure which version was true, and he didn't particularly care. It wasn't like Connor had disappeared, though. His presence lingered in the whispers, in the pointed glances, in the quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface. His absence wasn't a relief, it was a countdown. Jaden knew better than to think this was over. By the time the last bell rang, he had already made up his mind to head straight home. No unnecessary stops. No lingering in the halls. Just out the door, onto the bus, and away from whatever storm was still brewing beneath the surface. But the universe had other plans. As he turned the corner near the locker rooms, he caught sight of someone waiting. Coach Graves. Jaden slowed his steps. The man was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with an unreadable expression. He wasn't a big talker, but when he did speak, people listened. I heard what happened. Jaden didn't react. He had heard that sentence too many times already. Coach studied him for a moment before exhaling. Figured you had your reasons. Jaden shrugged. He wasn't about to explain himself. You a fighter? Jaden hesitated. He didn't like that word, not the way it was used now. He wasn't some street brawler, some kid looking for trouble. But he knew what Coach meant. He finally answered, "Been training since I was a kid." Coach nodded, like he already knew the answer. Yeah, that much was obvious. Silence stretched between them. Jaden wasn't sure where this was going. Then, Coach tilted his head toward the field. "I've been telling the wrestling coach to send me a few kids for recruitment. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use?" Jaden blinked. Wrestling? Coach must have noticed his hesitation. "Look, I know you can handle yourself. That much is clear. But there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power." Jaden exhaled. He didn't know how to respond to that. Coach crossed his arms. "I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not to be messed with. Now, prove there's more to you than that." Jaden didn't answer right away. For so long, fighting had been about survival, about standing his ground. But the way Coach was looking at him, the way he spoke, it wasn't about proving something. It was about being more. That night, Jaden sat on his bed, his uncle's old boxing gloves resting beside him. He thought about all the times he had held back, all the times he had walked away, and the one time he hadn't. Coach was right. Connor wasn't going to change. People would think what they wanted. But Jaden still had a choice. And maybe, just maybe, this time he'd make a different one. The gym smelled of sweat and old mats, the kind of scent that clung to the walls, ingrained in every inch of the space. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the room. Jaden stood at the entrance, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie, scanning the wrestlers as they moved across the mats in carefully controlled drills. He wasn't sure why he had come. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was Coach Graves' words still rattling around in his head. Maybe it was the fact that no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the fight with Connor had changed everything. He had been labeled the new kid who knocked out the quarterback, the one who wasn't afraid, the one who could fight. They didn't see the years of training, the discipline, the control. They saw fists meeting flesh, a body hitting pavement. They saw an image, not the reality. And that meant he had two choices. Let them define him, or redefine himself. Coach Graves stood near the edge of the mats, talking to another trainer, his eyes flickering toward Jaden as if he had been expecting him. He gave a slight nod, but didn't call him over. It was up to Jaden to decide if he wanted to take that step. He exhaled slowly. Then he moved forward. The moment he stepped onto the mats, he felt the shift. A few of the wrestlers noticed him, their glances quick but not unkind. They knew who he was. They had heard the stories. But here, he was just another body on the mat, another challenge to overcome. A few minutes later, the drill started. Coach paired him with a guy named Ethan. Solid build, sharp movements, someone who clearly knew what he was doing. They circled each other, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Then Ethan lunged. Jaden moved on instinct, sidestepping, feeling the familiar rush of muscle memory taking over. He kept his balance low, countering the move without thinking. But Ethan wasn't easy to shake. He adjusted, shifting his weight, using leverage instead of brute strength. Jaden gritted his teeth, adjusting his stance. It wasn't a street fight. It wasn't about throwing punches. This was different, measured, controlled. A game of skill. He liked it. The match ended with both of them panting, sweat dripping down their faces. Ethan gave him a nod, the kind that meant respect without words. Jaden nodded back. It was a small moment, but it meant something. For the first time since he had arrived in Richwood Heights, he wasn't just the new kid. He was something else. But the outside world hadn't forgotten who he was. By the time he made it to the locker room, the whispers had already started. Connor was coming back. Jaden heard it in passing conversations, saw it in the way people glanced at him when he walked by. There was a quiet hum of anticipation in the air, the kind that came before a storm. Nick and Kevin had been keeping their distance all week, but today, they watched him longer than usual, their expressions unreadable. Jaden didn't react. He had known this was coming. Connor wasn't the kind of person to let something like this slide. The question wasn't if he would do something, it was when. And Jaden would be ready. But this time, he wasn't planning to fight. He had already made his decision. Because real strength wasn't just about knowing how to throw a punch. It was about knowing when you didn't need to. The air in the school felt different. It wasn't just the usual background noise of hurried conversations, laughter, and the occasional sound of lockers slamming shut. There was something beneath it all, a quiet expectation, a tension stretched thin like a rope about to snap. Jaden could feel it as he walked through the hallways. Connor was back. The rumors had started early that morning. Some said he had been suspended. Others claimed he had taken time off to recover from the embarrassment. Either way, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here now, and people were waiting to see what would happen next. Jaden wasn't interested in giving them a show. The fight in the parking lot had already set something in motion that he couldn't undo. He had spent the past few days trying to shift the attention elsewhere, showing up to wrestling practice, putting his energy into something productive. But no matter how much effort he put in, the whispers followed him. He wasn't Jaden, the new kid, anymore. He was Jaden, the guy who put Connor Tanner on the ground. And that meant people expected another fight. At lunch, he felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him as he moved through the cafeteria. He ignored them, grabbing a tray and heading toward the same spot he had been sitting in all week, alone, away from the center of attention. But before he could reach it, he heard a voice. "Hey, new guy." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the noise around him. Jaden stopped. Slowly, he turned. Connor was leaning against a table, arms crossed, watching him with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something different about him now. A stiffness in his posture. A weight behind his gaze. For the first time, Jaden realized that Connor wasn't just angry. He was embarrassed. Jaden had taken something from him that day in the parking lot. It wasn't just about bruises or reputation. It was the fact that someone like Jaden, someone who wasn't supposed to challenge him, had made him look weak. Connor tilted his head, still smirking. "Guess you've been enjoying your little moment of fame." Jaden didn't answer. He had no interest in playing whatever game this was. Connor pushed off the table, taking a slow step forward. Funny thing about moments, they don't last long. Jaden stayed quiet, waiting. Connor's smirk faltered just slightly at the lack of reaction. He glanced around, noting the people watching. He wanted them to see this, to hear it. "You think one lucky punch makes you somebody?" Connor's voice dropped just enough that only Jaden could hear him. "You think it changes anything?" Jaden met his gaze. It wasn't about the fight anymore. It wasn't even about proving something. Connor wanted to drag him back into the chaos. He wanted Jaden to react, to give in to the same anger that had surfaced that day in the parking lot. But Jaden had already made his decision. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I'm done with this." The words were simple, direct, and they left Connor standing there, momentarily speechless. A murmur rippled through the cafeteria. This wasn't what people had been expecting. Connor let out a breathy laugh, but there was no real amusement in it. "Right, you're done." Jaden turned away, making his way to his seat. He could feel Connor's eyes burning into his back, but he didn't care. Let them talk. Let them whisper. He had nothing to prove. That afternoon, as he walked toward the gym for practice, Coach Graves was waiting for him by the entrance. He didn't say anything at first, just gave Jaden a long look. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good call." Jaden didn't need to ask what he meant. Because for the first time since he had arrived in Richwood Heights, he knew exactly who he was. And he wasn't going to let anyone else decide that for him. The sky had darkened by the time Jaden left the gym, the weight of another grueling practice settling deep in his muscles. He welcomed the exhaustion, the dull ache in his limbs reminding him that he had pushed himself harder than usual. The repetition, the drills, the sheer focus, it had all served a purpose. It was control. Something he had fought for his entire life. Outside, the parking lot was mostly empty, only a few cars remaining near the streetlights. The cool night air carried a quiet hum of insects, blending with the distant roar of engines from the main road. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back as he walked toward the sidewalk. Then he saw them. Connor, Nick, Kevin, and another guy he didn't recognize, but it didn't matter. The moment they stepped forward, blocking his path, Jaden knew exactly why they were there. It wasn't over. Connor had let him walk away in the cafeteria, but it had never been about just that moment. He needed something more, something that would undo what had happened in the parking lot, something that would make it seem like he was still in control. Jaden didn't react, keeping his expression unreadable. Connor smirked, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his stance casual but deliberate. Long practice. Jaden didn't answer. He knew better than to feed whatever this was. Connor nodded slowly, as if considering something. You know, I was thinking about what you said earlier. About how you were done with this. His voice dipped slightly, the amusement fading. Thing is, I don't think we're done. Jaden inhaled through his nose, steady and slow. He had been here before, in too many different places, in too many different ways. People like Connor, they never let things go. It wasn't about right or wrong, about fairness or reason. It was about control. About proving something to themselves, to the people around them. Nick shifted, his weight bouncing slightly on his heels, his gaze flickering between Jaden and Connor. He was waiting for a signal. Jaden could feel his pulse in his ears. Not from fear. Not from anger. Just awareness. Calculation. He was outnumbered. But they had already made a mistake. They assumed he was afraid. He shifted his bag higher on his shoulder, tilting his head slightly. You want to fight me because I embarrassed you, he said, voice even, controlled. Connor's smirk twitched, just for a second. Jaden had seen enough fights to know when someone wasn't in control of their own emotions. That's not how I'd put it, Connor replied, but his tone wasn't as steady as before. Jaden held his gaze. Then how would you put it? Silence stretched between them. Nick exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. Dude, let's just... Connor lifted a hand, stopping him. Then he let out a low chuckle. You really think you're better than me, huh? Jaden shook his head. I don't think about you at all. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but the words landed harder than any punch could have. For the first time, Connor didn't have a comeback. Jaden could see the frustration flicker behind his eyes, the way his jaw tightened. This was his choice. He could fight, or he could win. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there waiting. Connor inhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before exhaling, sharp and frustrated. Then he stepped back. Let's go, he muttered to the others. Nick hesitated, glancing between them, but Connor was already walking away. Jaden didn't move until they had disappeared down the street. Only then did he exhale, rolling his shoulders back. Because the truth was, he had already won. The following days at Richwood High were different, but not in the way Jaden had expected. Connor hadn't made another move. After their confrontation in the parking lot, the tension had lingered, but something had shifted. The whispers continued, but they had lost their edge. The stares still followed him, but they weren't as expectant. He wasn't sure what had changed, if it was Connor backing off, or if people had simply lost interest now that there wasn't another fight to watch. Either way, he didn't care. He focused on practice. The weight of his body pushing against the mat, the sharp commands from Coach Graves, the calculated movements of every takedown. It was grounding. Wrestling had become an anchor, something that made sense when the rest of the world didn't. And yet, despite everything, despite the distance he had put between himself and the chaos of the past few weeks, something still felt unfinished. It wasn't about Connor. It was about himself. He had spent so much time fighting against the way people saw him that he hadn't stopped to ask if maybe, just maybe, he was still holding on to something too. Maybe his uncle had been right. Fresh starts don't exist for people like us in places like this. But what if they did? He sat alone in the bleachers after practice, the gym quiet except for the faint hum of distant voices in the hallway. His bag sat at his feet, his water bottle half empty beside it. His body ached in that satisfying way that came after pushing himself past his own limits. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what came next. That's when he heard the footsteps. He looked up to see Coach Graves making his way toward him, his expression unreadable as always. Jaden sat up straighter, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Coach stopped a few feet away, looking down at him. You sticking with this? Jaden didn't hesitate. Yeah. Coach nodded, crossing his arms. Good. Silence stretched between them for a moment before Coach exhaled, tilting his head slightly. You know, when I first heard about you, I figured you were just another kid with a chip on his shoulder. Jaden didn't respond, but something in his chest tightened. Coach continued, his voice steady. I was wrong. Jaden looked up then, meeting his gaze. Coach studied him for a long moment before nodding. Keep showing up. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Jaden sat there, staring at the empty gym. Then he let out a slow breath. Maybe, just maybe, fresh starts did exist. You just had to be willing to take them. The quiet didn't last. For a few days, Jaden felt something close to normalcy. He followed his routine, school, practice, home. The weight of his reputation had started to fade, if only slightly. People still whispered, still stared, but it wasn't the same expectant energy that had followed him before. It wasn't about waiting for him to react. It was just curiosity now. He could live with that. But deep down, he knew the story wasn't over. And he was right. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, just as he was leaving school. The halls were nearly empty, most students already gone, the final remnants of conversation fading as people spilled out into the parking lot. Jaden had taken his time at his locker, not in any rush to leave. That's when he heard it. Not his name. Not even a voice he recognized. Just a sound, quick, sharp, the unmistakable impact of something hitting metal. He turned the corner and saw him. Connor, leaning against a row of lockers, one fist still pressed against the dent he had just made. His shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths, his posture tense, but his face was unreadable. Jaden stopped a few feet away, watching him. Connor didn't look up right away. His fingers curled and uncurled at his sides, his body language screaming frustration. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Connor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You know what sucks? His voice was quieter than usual, lacking its usual arrogance. It's not even about the fight. Jaden didn't answer. He let Connor speak. Connor ran a hand through his hair, still not looking at him. My dad doesn't care that I lost. Doesn't care that you knocked me on my ass in front of half the school. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. He cares that I made us look weak. Jaden studied him. He hadn't thought about Connor beyond their encounters. Hadn't wondered what was happening in his life outside of their conflicts. But now, looking at him, there was something different. The sharp edges had dulled. The smirk was gone. Connor wasn't here to fight. He was here because he didn't know what else to do. Jaden leaned against the lockers, mirroring his stance. He didn't say anything. Connor glanced at him then, just for a second, before shaking his head. I'm not apologizing, he muttered. Just so we're clear. Jaden almost smiled. Almost. I wasn't expecting you to, he said finally. Connor sighed, pushing off the lockers. He hesitated, his fingers tapping against his leg before stuffing his hands into his pockets. You don't have to look over your shoulder. I'm done. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Jaden watched him go. And for the first time, he believed it. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one way or another, things were finally changing. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way Jaden had expected. It wasn't the charged silence of waiting for something to happen, or the tense anticipation of an unresolved fight. It was different. Lighter, even. Like the school had finally decided to let go of the weight it had been carrying. Like it had finally decided to let him go. For the first time since he arrived at Richwood High, Jaden felt invisible in a way that wasn't suffocating. People still looked at him, still whispered his name, but the looks weren't filled with expectation anymore. They weren't waiting for the next punch to be thrown. They weren't holding their breath, hoping for another fight to break out. They had moved on. And so had he. At wrestling practice, Coach Graves pushed him harder than usual, not with the condescension of someone testing his patience, but with the measured intensity of someone who saw potential. Jaden wasn't just another kid trying to prove himself anymore. He was part of the team. That meant something. He had always been strong. He had always known how to fight. But here, it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about survival. It was about strategy, control. It was about knowing when to strike and when to wait. It was about being more than a name people whispered in the halls. And that, more than anything, was what he had been searching for. When practice ended that Friday, the locker room was buzzing with energy. Some of the guys were talking about an upcoming match, others were making plans for the weekend. Jaden wasn't part of the conversations, but for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider either. As he finished tying his shoes, he felt someone step up beside him. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. "You coming to the game tonight?" Ethan, the guy he had gone up against in his first wrestling drill. The guy who had barely spoken to him since. Jaden shrugged, closing his locker. "Didn't plan on it." Ethan leaned against the metal, arms crossed. "You should." Jaden raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ethan smirked. "Because it's what people do when they stop pretending they don't belong here." Jaden blinked, caught off guard. He had spent so much time resisting, so much time keeping himself separate from everything that happened within these walls, that he hadn't realized how much he had been holding himself back. Belonging wasn't something that was given. It wasn't something he had to wait for. It was something he had to claim. He exhaled, then grabbed his bag. "What time?" Ethan grinned. 7. Jaden nodded once, then walked out of the locker room, stepping into the cool evening air. For the first time since arriving in this town, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't worried about the whispers, about the fights, about the past that had followed him for so long. For the first time, he just let himself exist. And for now, that was enough.